On the right, you are looking at a React Native view, which is rendering a SwiftUI bottom sheet. Look at these interactions. It's incredibly smooth and it's all done on the native side. So the question is, how does this work? And how is this SwiftUI sheet rendering children which come from React Native? It's actually quite easy. So let's take a look at the code. So we've got our React Native app here, and you can see that I have a popover component with a trigger and content, just like Radix UI, just like you're used to. And the question is, what's going on under the hood? And how is this opening a native view on iOS? Well, when I click into pop over trigger, you might be thinking there's some sort of props magic happening, but actually it's just calling require native view. So this is going straight to the native side. So there are a few questions that emerge. How does Swift know which component is the trigger, which one's the content, and what it should do? Again, when I click open SwiftUI sheet on the right, and when I click open nested modal, it knows it's nested, it's all working, and I'm rendering React Native views inside of it. So I can change this and get a fast refresh. I can open nested modal, and if I click into this, again, it's just another popover with another trigger inside the content, and it all works perfectly. In fact, in here we actually have the built-in React Native button, which has no problem getting pressed. So I can change this to sheet, and that also has the fast refresh. All right, so how does it work? Well, let's click into popover trigger. And again, I can't get to my code here. There's no way to get to it. What I have to do is open up the Swift file. So I'll open XCode and show you that. Now, for what it's worth, I don't have much experience at all with Swift or SwiftUI. I am always just playing with it, but I've never built a full app with it. Okay, so here I have a SwiftUI view. I've got my Boolean saying if it's showing the popover, and then I have props, which are the things that are getting passed from React Native. Now, at the moment, the only prop that we're using is children. And if you want to learn more about how these props get passed back and forth, you can watch the video I released yesterday on YouTube, where at the end, I cover the release of SwiftUI and React Native. Okay, back to the code. The first thing I'm doing is looping over each child. And then I want to find the trigger child, right? The important thing is I want to know when something gets tapped, the content gets opened. Like when I hit this open SwiftUI sheet on the right, it's opening this sheet. Okay, so I have to have on tap gesture of the trigger. But how do I know what the trigger is? Well, I have this step which says if let trigger is child.view. So each child and children has a reference to the UI view. So I'm saying if the child.view is popover trigger view, then we use the child instance. Otherwise, it's null, meaning it'll just continue on to the next step, okay? Now, again, there might be some cleaner way to do this in Swift, but this worked for me. So in that case, I've gotten the trigger and that's being touched, okay? Next, I want to exclude the content from being rendered here because as you can see, you see the open SwiftUI sheet, but if I go back to my React Native code, here in popover content, I have this component which is not getting rendered anywhere. Like you're not seeing open nested sheet button. You only see that when I click this open. So how do I do that? So for that step, in order to kind of keep this radix style approach, instead of having any magic on the JavaScript side, we're just identifying. Here I'm saying if the child.view is popover content view, nil or null, otherwise it's the child. So any child that's not the trigger gets rendered as normal. Any child that is the trigger gets rendered being tapped. Any child that's rendered as the popover content, well, we're going to exclude that for now. Okay, so on to the last step. How do we actually get that content into the popover? Well, first I'm putting in a little bit of basic logic. I'm ignoring safe area. And then in SwiftUI, you have this really neat dot popover that you can just apply as a modifier. You can control it with is presented. So in the future, we'll actually want to have the ability to control it from the JavaScript side. You can set an arrow edge. I actually haven't gotten this working yet, where I want it to be able to do an inline popover, not just a bottom sheet. It works on iPad, but not quite yet on iOS. Okay, so onto this last step. I am saying if let content child equals props.children first. So it's just a pretty nice convenience function where, again, just like before, the dot view is popover content view. Okay, so all I'm doing is I'm looping over the children, finding the first one where the view instance is a popover content view, and there I return it. So that's what's going to be inside of the popover. And otherwise, I just return empty if we can't find that content view. Okay, now the missing piece here, you might be a little bit confused, is if here are all my modules to the left, I have this popover view, but like where is and what is this popover content and popover trigger view? What do those do? Actually, they're pretty much nothing. So if I click into it, it's just an empty class. It's just an extension of Expo view, which is an extension of RCT view, which is an extension of UI view. All I'm doing here is a little bit of a trick. I've created a certain kind of UI view, which I want to then later find. So there's nothing really special about this other than the fact that I want to use it when traversing children to find which one is the trigger and which one is the content. So if you've ever used Zego, you know that I actually do this using pick children. Specifically, I loop through all the children on the React side, find certain components, and extract their props. It's a little bit of a trick that you can do with React. And I actually have a video about this on YouTube. It's pretty long where I explain all the little details of how I do that. Now, it has some downsides. So let's go back to the JavaScript and I'll explain why this approach is much better, assuming it works. Okay, so here I have popover trigger and popover content, but I'm not looping over the children. I'm not extracting any props from JavaScript. And what that means is that I can actually take this component and nest it inside of another component, like content here, and this will still work. So what I'll do is I'll delete that, put in content, and now I still have open nested sheet. I can do 3 exclamation points and it opens. And what's nice is this is not using props.children on the React side. It's doing it on the native side, and it's actually accessing the underlying view. So I could even wrap this in a view and it's still working, right? This is a limitation of Zego, and we're kind of addressing it here by moving the work onto the native side. There's literally no work going on here on the JavaScript side. It's just exposing these views. And so if we wanted to then let this work for web, say, we can just do a counter file on web for vol or for a sheet or really anything. We can map it to radix, whatever we want. Now for Android, we'll have to see about that later. But right now, this is just exposing SwiftUI to React Native. And the missing pieces are like, where's the boilerplate? What other stuff do I have to do? I'll show you all the Swift files really quickly. Let's open XCode. I'll go to the sidebar. For each view that you want to expose from Swift to React Native, you have to do 2 things, assuming you're using Expo modules. There's a little bit less work if you're doing Nitro, but the views aren't quite live yet at the time of recording. First, I create a popover view, which is all the Swift UI code. And then I have to go to the popover module, which is actually exposing this to JavaScript. So I create the name, which is what you're going to import it as on the JavaScript side. I'm exposing the view, and that's about it. And so for each one of these views, I have to do 2 files. Popover content, this is the view, and then popover content module, where I expose it. Again, there's nothing special happening here. The popover content and popover trigger only exist so that I can identify them on the native side and make sure they render in the right place. It might have a few problems here or there with how children are rendered, but it's actually working quite great. Now, the last piece I'll mention is if you are using Expo modules to do this, I do recommend going down to the config, because here you have to remember to expose all of your modules. This is actually a pretty big complaint for me. It's very annoying. I forgot to put these modules here at the start, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out why they weren't importing properly, but got that part figured out. And now we have this component that lets us do nested sheets. And I think this is going to open the door to a lot of other components. You'll be shocked how many native elements in SwiftUI are super easy to use. And if we have first-class support for it, well, it's not that hard to access it in React Native. Let me know what you think. Thanks.